Hey everybody, Steve here. Just wanted to introduce you to a couple of player devices from Static Cling. The first one is called Autolatch, and Autolatch is a device that lets you do interesting things to note lengths, gates. And here's what it looks like. It's a sequencer, and then here's the different note lengths you've got. It actually covers quite a range of note values. So there's a 16th, obviously. It'll go as low as short as a 128th note, which is really short, and then all the way through the usual range, but it actually goes quite high, goes as high as 16 bars, which is really cool. So that's the auto latch, and I'll hide that for a second. And then there's Delta. So this is Delta here, and Delta is more complicated, but basically it's doing the same thing. It's manipulating the incoming notes and gates from other devices or from players. But this one you kind of design your own patches. It's kind of like a little modular synth. So you got to have a bit of that, sort of patching know-how, but people understand that on a basic level pretty well. And although these look a little complicated, there's actually a fairly limited selection of modifiers, and it's pretty easy to start to think about what they do. So there are note modifiers like transposing, or you can generate chords. There's velocity, you can make velocity adjustments. You can play around with the timing of things. You can play around with what they call flow, so maybe around like a random switch or what's called a sequential switch. These can make sort of patterns happen. There's an if, which is like a conditional module. I'm actually using the if, a couple of them here. And then a trigger switch, you can make triggers do interesting things. And then utilities, so I can split and merge these CVs. I've also got a separate CV output, and then set seed, which has to do with how the randoms work. I'm just going to show you the CV output here. So that's what the CV output looks like. I've got a couple of them going on here. So this is a player. It's attached to an incoming player, or it's attached to something else, but this takes the incoming note data and then feeds it to the output. So what comes in at the top goes here, and then what goes out at the bottom goes to the next device. It might be a piano or another player, it might be anything, any instrument. So that's the main through, and then there's these extra outputs. So if I'm going to do something with, for instance, the if condition, I want to feed it to a separate output. And in this case, what I'm doing to that if condition is something I want to use to play a bass guitar. So I'll show you that in a minute. So that's the delta. We'll start with the CVPT though. This is not from Static Cling, but this is really useful. This is making the rest of it possible. These players need incoming note data, and I can get it from many places, including an RPG-8. But an RPG-8 is not a player. So in order to turn it into a player, I have to convert its notes and gates into player information. And that's one thing that the CVPT can do. So if I play this arpeggiation, for example, you can see that it's getting notes from the arpeggiation right there. And then it's feeding them out to other devices maybe, or feeding them out to the next player in the stack. So that's what's going on there. That's the player. So if I flip around to the back, you'll see that what I've got is the note or the gate out and the note out from the RPG-8, feeding the input 1 and 2, gate and note of the CVPT. And that's what brings this musical information into the player. And once it's in, it travels through the stack. There's also outputs from here. So for instance, I could take what's coming in on 1 and 2, this arpeggiator, and it's kind of like a MIDI through or like a parallel connection. It just takes the same signal and passes it out. So I could direct this to a piano or to, a subtractor, like whatever. I'm not, though. I'm using these devices to make that happen. In fact, I'm using the Delta to do that. So I'm going to just start by showing you the auto latch. I'll play this pattern a little more, though. And while it plays, I'm going to adjust the gate lengths. So very staccato, much more legato, and eventually the notes get tied This actually does an interesting thing because it doesn't get them all. It seems to miss some. And I think that's got to do with some of the gates interfering with other notes because the gates are so long here. I'm not sure. It's cool though. So a little bit of an accident, but I could certainly make use of that. It's quite nice. Anyway, I'll put it back down to, something like that. So nice. It's a nice pattern. 2 bars of C minor 7. And then 2 bars of D minor 7. It's coming from my arpeggiator here. You can hear a bit of dynamics because the notes have different velocity values. So the arpeggiator picks that up. This one does, and I think many arpeggiators do. They pick the note velocity up. So it adds a bit of a dynamic to it. You can hear some of the notes are louder than others. They stick out a bit. All right, so, I could make this a little more interesting by varying the gate lengths. Kind of make it sound more human, more like there's a sustain pedal in play. When a pianist plays the piano, they don't play every note exactly the same length. They may want to try that, and they can probably do it if they're pretty good, but that's not necessarily how they play. So a bit of variety between the note lengths of each note is helpful. So, but instead of doing this or trying to automate it, what I'll do is get the latch to make that happen for me. So that's what the latch will do. It'll modify the gate lengths, the note lengths of the incoming notes. So right now I've got it set to, I'm going to run it forward, and I've got it set to a pattern of 16 beats or 16 pulses. So this will be 1 bar. It'll go through twice for each chord. And I'll just play this now and you'll hear what it sounds like. There, so you can hear a bit of a pattern, some shorter notes. Oh, there was actually this very long one. I wasn't even paying attention. I was reading mouse posé. I like this highlighted cursor, it's handy. I don't need that note to be so long because I want these notes to be kind of shorter in here. Still kind of a note holding on there that's fairly long. And this one's also fairly long. There. And a few longer notes at the end, so you start to notice a pattern. There. So that's a pattern on the gate lengths. I can also set it to random and get sort of a nice, more accidental feel with it. So that's nice. It suddenly brings that piano part really to life. It sounds much more like it's actually being played. Yeah, I think it adds a nice amount of life to the part. It would otherwise be quite static, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes you want to add a little bit of movement, a little bit of shape, a little bit of life. So, so that's the auto latch, and then I'm going to move on to Delta. So what Delta will do here is start to turn the sequencer or the arpeggiator into more of a sequencer. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. First I'll turn it on, we can have a look at it. So with Delta, you've got all these different modules you can work with, and you build a patch on the grid in the background here. So as I explained before, the input feeds the output, so that's the incoming notes from above the player, that's the outgoing notes, to the output of the player. And that's going through here, but at the same time I've got some things being split off. So I've taken the input and I've split it off to an if module, which I got from the flow. It's conditional. If is what we call a condition. If something is true, then ... If it's not true, then ... So here's my conditional. And my condition has to do with a MIDI note number. And what I'm saying here is if the note that's coming through, that is from the arpeggiator, is higher than or equal to E flat 2, then it's true, then it matches the condition. It'll go out of this output. But if it doesn't match the condition, that means that, if it's false based on this condition, then it'll go out of the false output. The bottom one is false, so the top one is true, bottom one is false. The top one is this true? Is these criteria met? Is this threshold exceeded? Or is it false? So I'm choosing the false. What that'll do is take the lowest notes, the notes below E flat 3 or 2 that are in the arpeggiator, and use them. It'll play them, and it'll play them to this extra CV output number 1. So that was defined as being CV output number 1. And I've got that patched into a subtractor base. Okay, so let's just hear what that sounds like now. I'll play this back, and it's going to give me the lowest note on each pattern, like each chord in the arpeggiation. So here we go. Nice. Now, cool thing I can do is this. I can change that threshold, play around with it, and I can start to let more notes out to the subtractor by making more notes false. So I'm going to play around here with the note value. Nice. That's a little loud. Let's bring it up. I can even let way more notes through. That's taking them all. I want to get rid of the very top ones. Maybe there. Now when it's that busy, maybe it's nice to have a shorter note, so I'm going to turn down the release time here on my subtractor. That's better. Okay, I needed those notes longer. The length of the notes was partly dictated by the gate length here, but most of these are very short. So for the most part, if they're played, quickly, it'll be more like this. But I want to make them ring a little longer, so I'm going to play with the envelope in the subtractor. Couldn't really do this over here unless I change the lengths of all of these, and then it would make it really muddy. So I'll change the length of the release time on the bass here. All right, so there you go. So that's a random one, forward. You can do different directions here. Of course, you can save all of these as patches, and it actually comes with quite a few really useful patches. So that's the auto-latch into the programmer and making the bass play into, into the delta, and so triggering the bass. I'm going to actually go back into that condition and just bring it back down. I want too busy. I think this will do it. That's what I want. No, I don't even want that high note. There, just a single note is what I want. All right, cool. So now we move on. And I thought to myself, well, if I can have the very lowest note, play an instrument, maybe I can grab some of the high notes in the arpeggiator and play an instrument. And I thought maybe a piano, sort of get a piano-y part happening. So that's what I did. So I split it off again from the output. I split the output off again and fed it into another if condition, but this time it's got to do with a different threshold. Okay. And it's also got to do with the notes that now do match. So I'm using the true events. So notes that are higher than or equal to A flat 3 are going to be played by CV output number 2, patched into the radical piano. So high notes in the arpeggiator are going to hit the piano. Now the highest notes are going to be normally at the same pitch as these ones, and I don't want that. It'll be like too doubly. I'm already using a piano, so I want to make these an octave higher. So I'm going to take the notes coming out of here, and before they reach the output, I'm going to run them through another processor, a little transpose, and bump it up by an octave. These are very convenient. Of course, you can set it anywhere you want, but these give you, the octave, a jump of an octave, which is cool. All right. So, and then I actually thought, well, you know what, maybe I'll be a little fancy here and I'll have another transposer that's going to change it by a perfect fifth. So we'll get a bit of a kind of a chord quality happening every time here. So two notes at once being played on the piano. They're parallel fourths, actually, in music theory. So I'll turn it on and I'll let you hear what it sounds like. Now you can see here the patch cable flashing. It shows you when the note is happening. That makes it very easy to monitor the flow, the signal flow on the Delta. I love that. It's really useful. Cool. So one thing I notice here is that the C minor chord is fairly mellow, but the D minor chord is quite strong, and it's being accentuated here. So it kind of bugs me. I'd like it to be more consistent from one to the other. So, and that's because my sequencer has more loud notes in the D minor chord than it does in the C minor chord. You can see the velocity values. So the velocities are higher. So obviously if I just drop the velocities down, then that would be easy enough. I could just bring the velocities down here, maybe take away 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever, or scale them down, and that would make them match, and that would solve the problem. But I want to show what I would do in Delta to make this happen, because sometimes this is what you want to do. You want to sort of process it and have it set up here, and you can modify anything that's in the track in different ways very easily. Sometimes more easy than editing it actually in the sequencer. All right, so what I'm saying there is the first chord is quite soft and the second chord is quite loud. So to make a difference between the velocity values less, I'll go into the velocity curve. I'll add a velocity curve module. And this is kind of like using a compressor, sort of. I'm going to take the note, and before it reaches the if condition, I'm just going to process its velocity. So initially it defaults to a one-to-one ratio, basically, like a compressor, on one-to-one, no change. So whatever the input velocity is, that's what you'll get on the output. If I want to sort of narrow the dynamic range between these velocity values, because they're too extreme coming from the arpeggiator, then what I would do is something like this. So I want to make lower velocities more equal to higher velocities. Okay, they're not as equal. They're that much less, but here lower velocities are more equal to higher velocities incoming in terms of the outgoing. The outgoing is always going to be fairly hot. Unfortunately, this turns everything up quite a bit. So what I've done right now will make all the velocities louder. So you'll hear this piano really quite sharply now. So it's too loud, too much velocity, but I like the consistency of it. Both chords are fairly much the same dynamically. So now I would just say, well, you know what? So hopefully there's a way to offset the velocity, take away or add to. Of course there is. It's a pretty basic and very useful utility. That's what I would be doing in the sequencer itself using the F8 key, but here I'm going to do it inside of the Delta. So I'll put the curved velocity value through the offset, then I'll feed that. Feed that into the condition. This gets a little, messy. Maybe I'll just move things over a bit so it's easier to see. There, that's a little easier to follow. Okay, cool. So now I'll offset the velocity. So it's too much. The velocity values are very high there. So I'm going to take, I don't know how much away. Sure, 36. Let's see what that does. nice. I like that value. I might even bring it down a little more and make it a little more atmospheric, but you know, whatever. So there you go. It's pretty straightforward. And now I've turned my arpeggiator into a 3-part sequencer, which is nice. I've got a piano part happening. I've got a bass line happening. I've got like call it bells happening in the radical piano. And I could, you know, continue this process. There's a total of 8 sets of CV outs on the Delta. I have direct access to everything the arpeggiator is doing here. And so it makes for some pretty interesting possibilities. And so I hope you've enjoyed this. And I'm going to just play some music for a little bit here. I'll see you again sometime.